Over 2,000 British soldiers fell in less than 30 minutes. Their finest generals were dead. Their bodies were packed in barrels of rum and shipped home in disgrace. And back in London, they buried the story. This is the Battle of New Orleans. The bloodbath Britain never wanted you to know about. The Empire's Grand Ambition, 1814. By the autumn of 1814, the British Empire stood as the most powerful military force on the face of the earth. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Great Terror of Europe, had finally been defeated and exiled to the island of Elba. For the first time in more than a decade, Britain's massive army and its legendary Royal Navy were free. Free to turn their full and terrible attention toward a young, troublesome nation across the Atlantic, the United States of America. The War of 1812 had dragged on for 2 grinding years. The Americans had declared it boldly, but fought it poorly. The British had burned Washington, D.C. to the ground in August 1814, walking through the streets of the American capital, setting fire to the President's house, to the Capitol building, to the Library of Congress. It was a humiliation that cut the young republic to the bone. But Britain wanted more. They wanted a decisive victory. They wanted a prize that would give them permanent leverage over America, a port, a city, a chokehold on the entire interior of the continent. And they had the perfect target in mind, New Orleans. Sitting at the mouth of the mighty Mississippi River, New Orleans was the commercial heartbeat of North America. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the river. Whoever controlled the river controlled trade flowing from the entire American interior: cotton, tobacco, grain, furs, the economic lifeblood of a young nation. Take New Orleans, and Britain would have America by the throat. In late September 1814, a letter arrived at the London home of Major General Sir Edward Pakenham. It was from Lord Bathurst, the Secretary of State for War. Pakenham was to command the British forces on a special expedition to the Gulf of Mexico. His orders were simple and absolute: take New Orleans. Pakenham was 36 years old. He was well-born, well-connected, and gloriously experienced in battle. His sister Kitty was married to the legendary Duke of Wellington himself. Pakenham had fought at Salamanca, at the Pyrenees, in the brutal campaigns of the Peninsular War against Napoleon's finest troops. He was confident, perhaps dangerously so. He had fought and beaten Napoleon's veterans. What could American backwoodsmen and militia possibly do against his battle-hardened redcoats? He would receive a horrifying answer. The man defending the city, Andrew Jackson. On the American side, the defense of New Orleans fell to Major General Andrew Jackson, a man who was in many ways the opposite of Pakenham in every way that mattered on the battlefield. Jackson had not been born into privilege. He was the son of Scots-Irish immigrants, raised in the Carolinas in hard poverty. As a 14-year-old boy during the American Revolution, he had been captured by British soldiers. When he refused to clean a British officer's muddy boots, the officer slashed him across the face and hand with a saber. Jackson carried those scars for the rest of his life, and he carried a burning, bone-deep hatred of the British to go with them. He was called Old Hickory by his men, because he was said to be as tough as hickory wood. He had fought duels, survived a bullet lodged near his heart for 19 years, suppressed Indian uprisings, and earned a fearsome reputation as a fighter who never, ever quit. Jackson arrived in New Orleans on December 1, 1814. What he found there alarmed him deeply. The city's defenses were almost non-existent. The roads, bayous, and waterways leading into the city from the Gulf were wide open. The population was a chaotic mixture of French Creoles, Spanish settlers, free black citizens, and American newcomers, many of whom were more suspicious of Jackson than they were of the British. Jackson immediately declared martial law. He began fortifying every possible approach to the city. He recruited anyone and everyone willing to fight. His army that gathered at New Orleans was like nothing the world had ever seen assembled under one banner: regular U.S. Army troops, Tennessee riflemen, Kentucky militiamen, Louisiana Creole volunteers, free men of color organized into their own fighting battalions, Choctaw warriors, Spanish and French volunteers, and most extraordinarily of all, the pirates of Barataria Bay. Jean Lafitte and his Baratarian privateers were wanted criminals, smugglers and pirates who operated from the Louisiana swamps. The British had actually approached Lafitte first, offering him a commission and a pardon if he would help them attack New Orleans. Lafitte had refused, and warned the Americans instead. Jackson, who had once called these men hellish banditti, swallowed his pride and accepted their help. Lafitte brought skilled cannoneers, desperately needed gunpowder, and 7,000 new flints for muskets. He would prove to be one of Jackson's most valuable assets. Jackson's men worked around the clock, building defensive earthworks across the Chalmette plantation fields south of the city. The line, which became known simply as Line Jackson, stretched from the Mississippi River on the right to the impassable cypress swamps on the left. It was a simple but brilliant defensive position. The only approach was a narrow corridor of open ground, and any enemy attacking across that open ground would be walking straight into the mouths of Jackson's cannons. The British approach, overconfidence in the swamps. The British fleet arrived in the Gulf of Mexico in early December 1814, over 50 warships, carrying approximately 7,500 battle-hardened soldiers. Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane, the naval commander, had been eager for this campaign for months. He was supremely confident. American forces had been brushed aside at Washington. How different could New Orleans be? On December 14, British gunboats destroyed the small American naval squadron on Lake Borgne in a fierce engagement. The road to New Orleans seemed open. But getting there proved far harder than anyone in the British High Command had imagined. The route from Lake Borgne to the city ran through miles of Louisiana swamp, alligator-infested bayous, dense stands of cypress trees draped in gray Spanish moss, mud that swallowed men to the knee with every step. British soldiers who had fought Napoleon's armies across the sun-baked plains of Spain now found themselves slogging through nightmarish, mosquito-clouded wetlands in the dead of Louisiana winter, hauling their equipment through freezing black water, sleeping in waterlogged camps, slowly being ground down before a single battle had been fought. On December 23, the British advance force finally emerged from the bayous and reached the banks of the Mississippi River just a few miles south of New Orleans. They were exhausted, cold, and spread thin. And that same night, Jackson struck. In a bold, shocking night attack, Jackson's forces slammed into the British camp. The fighting was chaotic and savage, bayonets and rifle butts in the dark, men unable to tell friend from enemy. The British were badly shaken. The attack inflicted significant casualties and, critically, stopped the British advance cold. Jackson then fell back to his earthworks at Chalmette and waited, letting his men dig and prepare. General Pakenham arrived on Christmas Day 1814, furious at his subordinates' failure to push forward and capture the city before the Americans could prepare. He immediately sized up the situation and began planning how to break through Line Jackson. On December 28, Pakenham launched a reconnaissance in force, pushing strong columns of troops toward the American line to test its strength. The response was devastating. Jackson's artillery opened up with a ferocity that shook even the experienced British veterans. The attack was driven back with heavy losses. Pakenham called off the assault and ordered his heavy naval cannons to be dragged all the way from Cochrane's ships, a Herculean effort that took days and exhausted hundreds of men. On New Year's Day 1815, the British opened a massive artillery bombardment of Line Jackson. For 3 brutal hours, the guns thundered. Jackson was sitting down to breakfast when the first British shells demolished his headquarters building. He barely escaped. But when the smoke cleared, the Americans had come off better in the artillery duel. Several British guns had broken carriages, one howitzer was completely disabled, and Jackson's cannon crews had held firm and fought back effectively. Pakenham called off this attack too and waited for more reinforcements. Frustration was building in the British camp. The army had been in the Louisiana swamps for weeks. Men were sick. Supplies were running low. The swamps were sucking the fighting spirit out of the finest army in the world. Something had to be done, decisively, quickly, and finally. The catastrophic plan, January 8, 1815. Pakenham settled on a plan for a massive, coordinated assault on January 8, 1815. It was ambitious, and on paper it was sound enough. His main force, some 3,000 troops under Major Generals Samuel Gibbs and John Keane, would advance in 2 powerful columns across the open plain of Chalmette Plantation against the main American line. Simultaneously, a secondary force under Lieutenant Colonel William Thornton would cross the Mississippi River in the night, seize the American artillery on the opposite western bank, and turn those captured guns against Jackson's line, enfilading the defenders from the flank and making the position untenable. There was one absolutely critical element to the plan. The troops assaulting the main American line needed fascines, heavy bundles of reeds and sticks, to throw into the ditch in front of the earthworks, and they needed scaling ladders to climb the rampart itself. Without these tools, the men would reach the American wall and simply be trapped at its base, unable to get over while the defenders shot them at will. The task of ensuring these fascines and ladders were ready and in position for the attack was assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Millins, commanding officer of the 44th Regiment of Foot. Pakenham himself gave Millins direct, explicit orders. Personally checked the location of the fascines and ladders on the evening of January 7. General Gibbs gave him the same order in writing. A map was provided showing exactly where the supplies were stored, in the forward redoubt. Millins was a haughty man. He was annoyed by what he considered to be the undignified assignment his regiment had been given, essentially a labor detail for the assault. He delegated the check to a subordinate officer and spent the evening otherwise occupied. When one of his captains diplomatically suggested he verify the supply locations before morning, Millins waved him off. "There will be plenty of time in the morning," he said. There would not be plenty of time in the morning. Meanwhile, Thornton's river crossing operation was already unraveling. The boats needed to ferry his troops across the Mississippi had been dragged through a canal, and in the process, the canal bank had partially collapsed, blocking some of the boats. Thornton's force of 1,200 men had to be reduced to roughly 560, and the crossing was massively delayed. He was supposed to have his men in position on the west bank well before dawn. Instead, the crossing was still underway as the main assault was preparing to begin. Pakenham was informed that Thornton was not yet in position. He was informed that Millins had not yet confirmed the location of the fascines and ladders. His staff officers urged him to delay. Even his own instincts told him something was wrong. But the general felt he could not wait. His army's morale was crumbling. They had been in the swamps too long. The attack had to happen now. Just before 6:30 in the morning, on the cold, foggy dawn of January 8, 1815, a flaming Congreve rocket arced into the dark Louisiana sky, the signal to attack. Thousands of red-coated British soldiers stepped forward in their famous disciplined lines and began their advance across the open fields of Chalmette. 30 minutes of hell. At first, the heavy morning fog helped them. The British moved in ghostly silence through the mist, their formations disciplined and steady, the kind of advancing army that had shattered the finest forces Napoleon could put in the field. The veterans among them had seen artillery before. They had faced cannon fire at Salamanca, at Toulouse, at Waterloo's bloody precursor battles. They were not men who frightened easily. But then the fog began to lift. And as it did, the full horror of their situation became clear. The 44th Regiment, leading the assault, reached the ditch in front of Line Jackson, and found almost no fascines, and almost no scaling ladders. Millins had led his men to the wrong location in the darkness. The 300 men he had finally sent running back to the redoubt to retrieve the supplies were now hopelessly scattered, crashing back through the formations of the advancing regiments behind them, throwing everything into confusion and chaos just as the American guns opened up. The American cannons, manned in part by Lafitte's expert Barratarian gunners, spoke with a terrible voice. Grape shot, canister rounds, and solid iron balls tore through the tightly packed British formations with savage efficiency. A single canister round, a tin can packed with dozens of iron balls that burst apart when fired, could knock down 10 men with one shot. The British were advancing in close order across open ground, with no cover whatsoever, toward a fortified position that they could not get over. It was not war. It was slaughter. General Samuel Gibbs, commanding the main attack column, watched He carnage with disbelief turning to fury. Through the smoke and screaming, he could be heard shouting, "Here come the 44th. Trying to rally the men, while under his breath vowing to hang Millins from the highest tree in the swamp if he survived the day. Gibbs himself did not survive. He was cut down by American fire, mortally wounded, and carried from the field. On the other flank, General John Keene's column briefly penetrated an unfinished American redoubt before being ground to a halt by the fire of the New Orleans Rifles and the 7th U.S. Infantry. Keene was also badly wounded. General Pakenham, watching his assault collapsing before his eyes, did what every great soldier does in his worst moments. He rode forward to lead his men personally. Riding at the head of the shattered 44th Regiment, trying to push them forward toward the wall by his own courage and example, grape shot from an American cannon tore into his left knee and killed his horse. He was helped to his feet by his aide, Major MacDougall, and wounded again almost immediately, this time in the right arm. Then a third devastating blast of grape shot struck him in the spine. He was carried from the field and died shortly afterward, lying under an oak tree on the edge of the battlefield. Within 30 minutes, the British assault on the main American line had been utterly destroyed. Of the 3,000 men who advanced under Gibbs and Keene, 2,000 became casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, in that single half-hour. The field of Chalmette Plantation, which had stood brown and frost-touched in the grey dawn, was now covered in the fallen bodies of red-coated soldiers. A Kentucky soldier who survived the battle wrote these words afterward. When the smoke had cleared and we could obtain a fair view of the field, it looked at first glance like a sea of blood. It was not blood itself, but the red coats in which the British soldiers were dressed. The field was entirely covered with prostrate bodies. On the American side of Line Jackson, the defenders watched with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Some had never fired a gun in battle before. Some of the Kentucky militia had arrived so poorly supplied that a third of them had no weapons at all. Jackson himself had worried for weeks whether his improbable collection of soldiers, pirates, free black men, Indian warriors, and frontiersmen could hold against professional British troops. They had not merely held. They had inflicted one of the most lopsided defeats in the history of warfare. The hidden humiliation, what Britain tried to bury. In the aftermath, the British Army, once the terror of the civilized world, faced a withdrawal that was as grim as the battle itself. General John Lambert, who now commanded by default, ordered a full retreat. The army packed up and began the long, miserable slog back through the swamps to the Gulf. The bodies of Pakenham and his second-in-command, Major General Gibbs, both killed in the battle, needed to be transported home to England for burial. The solution chosen by their subordinates speaks volumes about the desperate practicality that governed this entire campaign. Both generals were placed inside barrels of rum to preserve their bodies for the long ocean voyage. Pakenham's barrel was shipped back to Ireland, where he was buried in the family vault at Killucan. The Duke of Wellington, upon learning of his brother-in-law's death, was not merely grief-stricken, he was furious. He placed the blame squarely on Vice Admiral Cochrane, whose logistical failures and overconfidence had set the entire disaster in motion. Wellington wrote bitterly that the expedition to New Orleans had been ill-conceived from the beginning, and that Pakenham had been sent to his death on a fool's errand. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Millins, the officer whose failure to locate the fascines and ladders had directly precipitated the catastrophic assault, was court-martialed after the campaign. He was cashiered from the army in disgrace, his military career destroyed by a single night of laziness and arrogance. But here is where the story takes its darkest turn, the part that was deliberately buried. Back in Britain, the disaster at New Orleans was met not with honest accounting, but with institutional silence and carefully managed embarrassment. The war with America had already been officially ended by the Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, 15 days before the battle. The treaty news simply hadn't reached New Orleans in time. This convenient fact allowed the British to frame the catastrophe not as a defeat, but as a tragic irrelevancy, a battle that should never have happened, fought over nothing, and therefore not worth dwelling upon. British newspapers gave it minimal coverage. There were no triumphant accounts of heroic last stands, no hagiographies of the fallen, the kind of glorious defeat narratives that the British are famously skilled at constructing, as they did at Waterloo and the charge of the Light Brigade. New Orleans was simply, quietly set aside. The official dispatches minimized the scale of the losses. The court-martial of Millins was handled as discreetly as possible. The deeper embarrassment was strategic as well as military. The British had come to New Orleans with grand ambitions, not merely to win a battle, but to seize control of the Mississippi Valley, to potentially reclaim the Louisiana Territory, to establish a permanent stranglehold on American commerce and ambition. All of that had died on the fields of Chalmette Plantation in 30 minutes, at the hands of pirates and frontiersmen and free black soldiers who were supposed to be no match for Wellington's veterans. In America, of course, the story was told very differently. The making of a legend, Jackson's America. The news of New Orleans swept across the United States like a thunderstorm. Americans had spent 2 years hearing mostly bad news, defeats, the burning of Washington, the humiliations of a war they had started and couldn't seem to win. Now this, a total, annihilating victory, won by ordinary Americans against the greatest army in the world. Andrew Jackson became an overnight legend. Songs were written about him. Newspapers across the country published breathless accounts of the battle. The victory at New Orleans was held up as proof of everything Americans wanted to believe about themselves, that free men fighting for their homes were worth more than paid professional soldiers fighting for an empire, that the rough, democratic energy of the frontier was more than a match for old-world aristocracy and military tradition. The myths grew quickly. Popular songs and stories credited Kentucky riflemen with the victory, the romantic image of the lone frontier marksman cutting down British officers at impossible ranges. Modern historians are clear on the actual truth, it was Jackson's artillery that did the real killing. The cannon fire of his Barratarian and regular gunners that tore through the British formations. But the myth served a purpose, and myths have a way of surviving even when the facts are known. The Battle of New Orleans ended the War of 1812 in American memory as a triumph, even though the war itself ended in essentially a draw, with the Treaty of Ghent restoring the pre-war status quo. None of that mattered. New Orleans had happened. The Redcoats had been driven back. America had proven, at least to itself, that it could stand against the greatest empire on earth. Andrew Jackson's path from the fields of Chalmette to the White House was essentially a straight line. The hero of New Orleans won the presidency in 1828 and served 2 terms. His legend shaped American politics and mythology for generations. The battle that should never have been fought, the battle that came after the war was already officially over, turned out to be one of the most consequential engagements in American history. The hidden truths history forgot to tell. There are layers to the Battle of New Orleans that history, particularly American popular history, has consistently smoothed over or ignored entirely. The first is the role of black soldiers. Among Jackson's defenders were 2 battalions of free men of color, black Creoles and free African Americans from New Orleans and Louisiana who took their place in line Jackson and fought alongside white militiamen, Native American warriors, and European immigrants. They fought with distinction, and Jackson himself commended them in his general orders after the battle. But within a generation, as the culture of the American South hardened around the ideology of racial slavery, the memory of black soldiers fighting heroically in defense of American soil became inconvenient. Their role was minimized, then largely forgotten in mainstream historical narratives for more than a century. The second hidden truth is the story of what the British were actually planning to do with New Orleans once they took it. There was a persistent and widely believed rumor in 1815 that the British had used beauty and booty as their watchword, implying that the soldiers had been given license to plunder and assault the city's population. 5 British officers later signed sworn statements denying that any such order was ever given. The rumor was almost certainly American wartime propaganda. But it also reflected a genuine fear of what British occupation might mean for a city of unusual racial and social complexity, with its large population of free people of color, its tradition of relative racial liberalism compared to the American South, and its enormous economic value. The third truth is the geological reality of what was being fought over. New Orleans and the mouth of the Mississippi were not simply military prizes. They were the key to the economic future of North America. The river was the highway of the interior continent. If Britain had taken and held New Orleans, even as a negotiating chip, the entire history of American westward expansion might have been different. The Louisiana Purchase might have been partially reversed. The United States might have been permanently hemmed in east of the Appalachians, its growth stunted, its future mortgaged to British commercial and strategic interests. The Battle of New Orleans was not a pointless postscript to a war already over. It was a desperate gamble by a great empire to reshape the future of a continent. And it failed in 30 minutes, because a colonel couldn't be bothered to check where the ladders were stored. The rum barrel and the rampart. The British Army completed its evacuation from Louisiana by late January 1815. They sailed not home in triumph, but away in defeat, their dead generals rolling in their barrels of rum, their regimental colors tattered, their plans for empire in North America lying as cold and still as the bodies left behind on the frost-touched fields of Chalmette. The battlefield was preserved. Today it is the Chalmette Battlefield, part of the Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve, managed by the U.S. National Park Service. Visitors can walk the ground where those extraordinary 30 minutes unfolded, along the faint traces of the earthworks that Jackson's men built, across the open field that the British crossed, to the edge of the swamp that anchored the American left. New Orleans itself survived. It grew and thrived. The Mississippi flowed on, and American settlers poured west across the Louisiana Territory, the territory Britain had hoped to reclaim. The empire that had burned Washington and ruled the seas and beaten Napoleon met its limit in a Louisiana swamp, stopped by a ragtag army of frontiersmen, pirates, free black soldiers, and Choctaw warriors fighting behind a wall of mud and cotton bales. The British tried to bury it. History tried to simplify it. But the truth of New Orleans is more interesting, more complex, and more significant than either the triumphant American myth or the British official silence ever acknowledged. 2,000 British soldiers fell in 30 minutes. A great empire's ambition died in a Louisiana swamp. And a president was born in the smoke of Chalmette Plantation. That is the story of the Battle of New Orleans. The bloodbath Britain tried to hide from history.